Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all. Welcome to the Baker Institute. Thank you all for being here. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I would like to recognize Vitalia Teresiuk, the Consul General of Ukraine. Thank you. Welcome as well to you, Consul General. And I know our audience, as you can see from that applause, joins me in applauding the courage and the determination with which your countrymen are resisting aggression and protecting the independence of your country. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's a real honor for me tonight to introduce tonight's speaker because he is a foreign policy expert who can give us an enlightened perspective on what is happening in Ukraine and how it might affect the global balance of power. A fourth-generation Texan, he's serving his 9th term representing Texas's 10th district in the U.S. Congress. That's the district stretching from Katy all the way to Austin. Since 2019, he's been the ranking Republican on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. In short, he is a national security expert with an encyclopedic knowledge of foreign affairs, one who has focused a watchful eye on Moscow for quite some time now. Way back in 2016, he was prescient when he bluntly proclaimed, "I don't think Mr. Putin has our best interests at heart." Prior to being elected to Congress, he served as Chief of Counterterrorism and National Security in the United States Attorney's Office, Western District of Texas, and he led the Joint Terrorism Task Force charged with detecting, deterring, and preventing terrorist activity. He has also served as Texas Deputy Attorney General under current U.S. Senator John Cornyn and has been a federal prosecutor in the Department of Justice's Public Integrity section in Washington, D.C. After graduating from Trinity University in San Antonio, he earned his law degree from St. Mary's University Law School, where he later received the school's Distinguished Graduate Award. He is also a graduate of the Senior Executive Fellows Program of the School of Government at Harvard University. Now, I don't want to get into politics too much tonight, but one of the tired media refrains we often hear today is, "Where have all the good Republicans gone?" Well, tonight's speaker is one of the many good Republicans who works diligently, intelligently, and with dignity to help us build a better nation and a better world. He's not a grandstander. He's a hard worker, the kind that is focused on getting the people's business done. Most importantly, he is as true to his country as he is to his word. And so, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure for me to introduce a good friend and fellow Texan, the Honorable Michael McCaul.
Wow, I need to get a video clip of that, those remarks. Secretary, it's great to be here. He's one of my heroes. Watched him under Reagan, Chief of Staff. We saw Reagan bring down the Soviet Union and all these little countries that formed after that. And here we are today, full circle. And when we were back in his office, I said, what would Reagan do? What would Reagan do? I think all of us in this room know what he would do. He would stand with Ukraine, and he'd stand strong, and he'd be giving you a hell of a lot more weapons than you have. I'll tell you that. Yeah, I think about 1939, my father was a bombardier on a B-17, bombed the Nazis. And when I just came back from Poland for the second time in 3 weeks up to the Ukrainian border. We were in Romania, just got back yesterday, met with NATO. 1939, America was in a state of isolationist. We have many in our party, or some, who would ask the question, why do we care about Ukraine? Why is Ukraine important to us? We should be more concerned about our own backyard. And I understand those sentiments, but it's ignorant of the worldview of what is happening. Ukraine stands for freedom, democracy, on the edge of dictatorship. Ukraine is the beacon of freedomship against the four major nations against democracy, that being Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. What happens in Ukraine will impact what happens with Russia, China, Iran, North Korea against not only the United States' interest, but democracy. You know, this American song of freedom that we believe in, that we talk about, that's in our Declaration of Independence, our Constitution. And that's why it's so important. When the images started coming out of Ukraine and the barbaric acts of the Russians and what they're capable of doing, when I was in Poland, they said, sir, this is nothing new to us. We've seen this story before. I think my mic went off. But we've seen this story before. They rape girls. They rape the mothers in front of the children. They bombed a maternity hospital, for God's sakes. A maternity hospital. The image of the pregnant woman being wheeled out of the hospital, only to die later that day along with her baby. A building with children so big we could see it from the satellites. In Russia, what did they do? They bombed it. When Bucha happened, and the story was coming out about the crimes against humanity and the war crimes, I see all the pictures, and they're some of the worst things I've seen in my lifetime. And I've seen a lot of bad things. But civilians with their hands tied behind their back, shot in the head or decapitated, bombing the elderly. We found out when we got the plans. Now, we had the plans back in the fall. We knew what Putin wanted to do. Not everybody believed it. And we tried to warn everybody what was going to happen. But those plans said very clearly to kill innocent civilians as part of their battle plan, because it will break the will of the Ukrainian people. Well, guess what, Consul General? The will of the Ukrainian people has not been broken. It's the will of the Ukrainian people that's going to defeat the lack of will on the Russian soldier. That's changing. We never thought we thought, I was told, and he went big, by the way. He went for the whole country. But I was told in 4 days this whole conflict would be over. You have a puppet government in Kyiv. And boy, did the Ukrainians surprise us, and boy, aren't we proud of what you've done. You've earned our support, and we need to get the weapons in. And I've been on the forefront last November with this administration. Get the weapons in. Get them in now before the Russians invade, when we knew they were going to. You need the jets. We're getting, the Switchblade drones. We're getting lethal equipment in. The Congress has had to lead where some have not. Good news is NATO is unified like I've never seen it. And I would attribute Mr. Zelensky and unfortunately Mr. Putin for that. So we met with the NATO, and they've never seen it more unified, but NATO has to stand up and not just defend NATO, but help defend Ukraine. And I asked the question of the Secretary General, if they drop, God forbid, chemical weapons or tactical nukes in Ukraine, what will be the response? Will the world sit back idly and do nothing? 1939, Hitler invades Poland. America stood back idly, and it wasn't until Pearl Harbor that we got into this conflict. God, I hope that doesn't have to happen. I hope we see Ukraine victorious. But Mr. Putin's very determined, and he has the butcher of Syria now that he's assigned as his general. This is a man who dropped barrel bombs and chemical weapons on Syrians, civilians. It's hard to imagine that this is happening in our lifetime. This is something of my father's generation and my father's war, not of today. And we can't sit back idly and watch the butcher of Syria. We know the battle, it's a quiet before the storm. And I just returned from there. The good news is there are a lot of unmarked 18-wheelers going into Ukraine filled with weapons from all across NATO. There are S-300s going in, anti-aircraft, anti-missile. We have the anti-tank. We're going to get the Brit anti-ship. But the Ukrainians with their Neptune, which is not as sophisticated as our Harpoon, what did they do today? They sunk a Russian battleship. Geez, I mean, how cool is that? This is like David and Goliath. It's like watching it. To me, it is absolutely, here we are into the second month of this conflict, and their resilience, their fighting spirit reminds me of our founding fathers fighting for freedom and independence. And I know at the end of the day, and I know we have a Q&A, Ambassador, I don't want to go into over my time, but we have a lot to talk about. But I am optimistic because at the end of the day, you have the moral superiority and you have the will. And you're fighting for freedom. And as Reagan said, freedom is only one generation away from extinction. And nobody fought for freedom more than Ronald Reagan and you, sir, Mr. Secretary. So proud of what y'all did back then. First president I had the opportunity to vote for. And he was a Democrat back then. He'll tell you. But, I was looking at Carter in 1979. There was rising gas prices, inflation, an embassy taken over by terrorists and the nation. And I see some parallels, but I think this guy has actually topped Mr. Carter. And we can't let that, happen again. This is the largest invasion in Europe since my father's war, World War II. It is a moment in history. This is an historical moment. And the eyes of the world are watching. And it's asking of us, what did you do? What did you do when the bombs hit Ukraine? How did you respond? How did you respond when Hitler invaded Poland? What did the nations of the world do who abstained from the UN Security Council resolution, who stood in abstention when freedom was under attack? That is the question of our time, of my lifetime for sure. Maybe not my father's. But at the end of the day, like Churchill talked about with respect to appeasement, you look at Chamberlain and Hitler, what happened there. Peace in our time. Churchill was right, and Ronald Reagan was right. Peace through strength. That is the only way you maintain freedom and democracy in this world. And that is what these great fathers before us have taught us. And it's the lesson of history that we can't let it repeat itself today. So probably already talked enough, but thank you so much for having me. Secretary, I can't tell you what an honor it is to be in your presence again, and have a great time on your African hunting trip. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman, for being here.
Thanks.
Now that you've answered all my questions, well, why don't we talk about the price of gas? You're on the Intelligence Committee, and so you're one of the most informed members of Congress. Can you give us, as much as you can, your assessment of the situation on the ground in Ukraine today?
So we got the battle plans in a classified setting last fall, and it was we were absolutely certain that an invasion was going to take place. Zelensky was, because there's a lot of interrelationship between Russia and Ukraine, maybe not as convinced, our NATO allies not nearly as convinced, but we believe the intelligence was very real. I can't talk about the methods and how we acquire it, including innocent civilians was in that plan. They had a couple of options. He could have just gone to the Donbass. He's already got Crimea. That would have been actually probably from a tactical standpoint smart, but instead he decided to go big, and that would be, so you had the battalions up in north of Kyiv that were going to launch into the capital city, probably level those beautiful cathedral churches because they're Ukrainian and not Russian Orthodox, where Kyiv is where Russian Orthodoxy was born. Then Donbass, Russian separatists. The Duma had already declared them independent states, the two states there. Mariupol is under 80%'s been leveled, and they're still fighting. And then eventually all the way to Odessa, which is important because what he's trying to do is cut off the Black Sea. And then he can cut energy and then access to the Black Sea, and then choke the Ukrainians who will not be able to get their wheat, which is number 3 in the world, and sunflowers out into commerce. And so, and it also threatens Moldova, where you have that section, Transnistria. I probably mispronounced that, but Transnistria that has the 8,000 Russian soldiers. When we're in Romania, they're very worried Odessa will fall.
Right.
And then Moldova not being Article 5, not being a NATO country, Moldova falls as well, and then they're right on the border of the Romanian border. I think right now they're rethinking their military strategy to move out of Kyiv and just take this hard fight. When we met with the former defense minister of Romania, now the prime minister, he said, I know the Russians well, they're not stopping. And don't think for a minute that this thing's over. They are going to put a full-fledged assault now on Donbass, Mariupol, Crimea, and then into Odessa. But these UK anti-ship weapons coming in are key, and the fact that the Ukrainians already sunk a battleship is, from a morale standpoint. Remember, these troops are told, they're lied to. They're like, you're going on an exercise mission, and then you're going in to liberate Ukraine from the Nazis, and then they get into the country and they realize that's really not the case. And we saw an apology written, like, please don't blame us. We apologize. They were lied to.
They were lied to.
And that's why I think, to the last point, when I would ask at the 82nd Airborne, we were at these guys, these NATO guys, but mostly Americans, they're the guys moving the weapons into Ukraine. And so we met with them. We were at the airport, and all of a sudden, in 3 weeks, they have the Patriot battery systems up to harden that target. And those guys are heroes because they're logistically moving all these weapon systems into Ukraine, which by the day are more and more important.
It was very interesting that the administration decided to reveal a great deal of intelligence before Putin made the actual move. Was this done in conjunction with Congress? Were you surprised by this, that we were pouring out all this intelligence? Was it a coordinated move between the two sides of the street?
Yeah. I mean, we had exquisite intelligence. And I thought, that's the one, I will applaud the administration or the intelligence community for the way that they were able to declassify in advance these false flag operations, that being, somehow saying that the Russians are under attack and say the Donbass and therefore justifiable to go in to invade. Hitler, by the way, did the same thing in Poland to justify his invasion. And no, I think the way that was handled, I think Democrat, Republican, we believe that was really the smartest play, and it educated NATO that this was real.
President Biden, the press is saying he's ad-libbing on some of these rhetorical statements he's made, like, for God's sake, Putin should be out of power, which was interpreted as the American president asking for regime change in Moscow, or he just used the word genocide now. What's your take on the president's rhetoric? There's a school of thought that maybe he shouldn't be demonizing Putin so much, because at the end of the day, if he's still there, he's the guy to negotiate. After. What's your take on this?
Yeah, I think every time he goes off script, he creates an international incident. But having said that, I mean, Secretary, you get to, but Reagan never would have said tear down this wall if he had stayed on script, and he always wanted that in that speech, and that's his most famous line. But I think the words of the president matters. But getting to the negotiations, I think that's what you're talking about.
Right.
I think once this president, the Russians have crossed the Rubicon here with these war crimes. And I passed on the bill, my bill, war crimes bill, on the floor of the House, bill calling it out what it is. These are war crimes. And we need to treat it as such. We need to gather the evidence, and then we need to take it to an international tribunal for prosecution. We have to hold them accountable. This is not acceptable in the 21st century. It's just not acceptable. When the bomb they found that hit the train, that bomb that hit that train of children said, for the children. So, but this is, I don't think you ever take negotiations off the table, but what I'll tell you is in my intelligence briefing, Putin views that as weakness. He thinks that every time you go to the table to negotiate, he views that as a weak moment. And I think we need to have projecting strength against him. If you're going to negotiate out of strength, not weakness. And too long we've been in too weak of a position, against Putin. And I think he views that as a weak thing. And I think it's going to be very difficult now for Zelensky to be able to go to Putin after these horrible images and these horrific crimes against humanity. It just makes it worse. So our DOD is under an order from the commander-in-chief not to escalate. Don't be provocative, and therefore don't send in the jets that you're asking for. We're already sending weapons in. It's no secret to Putin. I don't understand how sending jets in is going to change, the equation. We need to send as much in there as possible, because we're really at a defining moment in this military campaign against, now it's going to be the general who is the butcher of Syria. This is the key pivotal moment. And if we don't get those weapons in, and as many as we can now, we have the opportunity to change the course. At the beginning, it was never that Ukraine could win. It was just how much can we defend them before they lose. Now the narrative has become, Ukraine can win this. But we have to be behind you, and we have to help you win.
When you refer to jets, are you referring to like the MiG-29s that Poland has, that they go into Ukraine, and then we would reinforce what Poland is giving with American jets?
Yes.
And you don't think that would be enough of a trigger for Putin to do something even more radical?
I don't. I think, and you're going to see MiGs coming in from some other NATO partners already. That's what they know how to fly. But what I found on my trip, just coming back, is that we're teaching them how to use not only Russian. So there's a big shift in NATO. Everything's going to be on the eastern flank.
Right.
So all the weapons, Russian weapons, the eastern flank of NATO has, they're putting into Ukraine, and then it's our responsibility to backfill these with, say, when you send the S-300 aircraft anti-missile, then we send in our Patriot battery to our NATO ally to backfill. And so you're going to see that progression. But what we also found is that we're actually able to train the Ukrainians how to use American technology like the Switchblade drone, which is highly lethal and highly effective, more so, I would argue, than a MiG would be. So you're seeing a change, I think, in the course of this strategy. And remember, our Green Berets were in Ukraine training the Ukraine military, which is why they're so effective. They didn't just wake up one day and decide to fight. We've been training them for a while.
It's interesting your comment on negotiations, because I think the conventional wisdom, like very much get your opinion on, is that there are about 3 ramp-offs. One is negotiations, along the lines we've heard in the press, and which are very problematic. Neutrality, the arrangements for Donbass and the Ukrainian territories, and security guarantees, obviously. So that's obviously one ramp-off. The other ramp-off that people talk about is some sort of political transition in Moscow, where some other leader comes to power who might be more amenable to a negotiated settlement. That's, again, highly problematic. The third one is more of the same. The Ukrainians have proven, as you've noted so well, their incredible patriotism and fighting for their land. And the world, I think, has been quite surprised by the inefficiencies, if I could use that word, in the Russian military, in both command and in their fighting capabilities. But more of the same. What does that mean? There's going to be a continual warfare in the heart of Europe? Because, as we were discussing with the Consul General in the lobby, the Russians certainly can occupy more space in Ukraine, but they can never occupy the Ukrainian people. No. And there's always going to be an insurgency. Is that the future?
It's one of the options, right? And that's why I'm optimistic, because I don't think the Russians, and given their lack of will in this, you remember, they're bringing the same worn out soldiers over.
Right.
They have conscripts who don't want to be in the military. And I think that the will of the Ukrainians will win long term. It's impossible for Russia to sustain an occupation of this scale of 40 million people with the will to fight that they have. And you'll continue to see weapons coming in. And it may be their next Afghanistan. We hope it doesn't go.
Not, yeah.
We really hope it doesn't go that long. I don't think Putin's going to leave anytime soon, and so negotiations. I mean, I've heard,
right.
Legitimizing Crimea, Donbass, neutralizing NATO status. I think, but after what the world has seen, it'd be very difficult for Zelensky to go down that road. I just think at the end of the day, you haven't asked the ultimate question, and that is, at what point does he decide? Because their competency has proven to be such. I mean, they're very good at their nuclear stockpile. They've modernized. They have more tactical nukes than we do. They have hypersonics, and we don't have those. But their combat units are.
Right.
It's World War II style. It's old tanks, and their readiness is not what we thought it was, and that was played out in Belarus. And in Kiev, and our military tells me they're far less competent than we thought they were going to be. But if the Scorpion gets backed into a corner and gets too desperate and decides to launch a chemical weapon or a tactical nuke because it's his last option, I think that's what we worry about, and we talk about this a lot. When I was at NATO, they talk about this a lot in terms of what would the free world do in the face of something like that? I hope that doesn't happen, but we have to be prepared for this because he's done it in the past. All you got to do is look at Syria, and what, the butcher did there. Tacit approval aside, throwing the weapons in. But they were behind it, and they were complicit with it. And it's the same battlefield, plan.
Do you agree that one of the terrible lessons being learned in the Ukrainian crisis is that certain countries and regimes are saying it's really important to have WMD, then your enemy won't attack you as forcefully as they can? And of course, there's a whole history of the Bucharest agreement where Ukraine voluntarily gave up its nuclear weapons, but for security guarantees that were never really codified. If I'm not mistaken in that, I don't think they were really codified. What is your assessment, Congressman, of the response by the NATO countries in the EU? You've alluded to this, that they, in a way, Putin has certainly miscalculated since he has been opposed for reasons we've known for decades to NATO expansion east, and also EU as being the democratic countries vis-a-vis authoritarian countries. But his military actions in Ukraine have solidified the EU and NATO. And another question in this line is, do you support further eastward NATO expansion like Finland and Sweden?
No, yeah, I mean, 100%. I think Putin's goal was to divide NATO. And if anything, he has united it stronger than we've seen it probably in our lifetime. And if we add Sweden and Finland, and when I was at NATO, I asked that very question of the Secretary General, will they ask for NATO membership? He said yes. Will NATO vote for this? Yes. And I can't think of a bigger shot across the bow at Mr. Putin than that, because he's going to see an even more unified, stronger NATO, representing the free world. You talk about NATO as if it's one generic entity, and it's not. No. The eastern flank, they understand Russia a lot better, than France and Germany and some of the other countries. I think they're finally waking up. You finally see Germany putting in 2% plus GDP into, to their military. And let's not forget about Nord Stream 2. I strongly opposed Putin's expansion of his pipeline around Ukraine into Germany and, making Europe dependent on Russian energy as he shuts off the Black Sea from Ukraine, as he puts his warm water port in Syria to build a pipeline from Iran to the Mediterranean into Europe. And then he's got the Wagner Group in Libya, where there's a lot of energy. That's part of his big, grand, scheme. We have to put presidential waivers in these sanctions. I just never dreamed we'd have a president waive the sanctions. Mm-hmm. And then on the National Defense Authorization, I passed an amendment to take the waiver out. And you saw that empower and embolden Putin, that the United States would allow him to complete his pipeline from Russia into Europe. We did the New START treaty in January without any concessions. You go to May, he waives sanctions on Nord Stream 2. When are the Russians starting to amass their military presence around Ukraine? In March of last year. Then August, what happens then? Afghanistan. One of the this unconditional surrender to the Taliban. We can argue whether we should have gotten out or not. I think we should have maintained Bagram Air Base, our great ISR capability, but instead, a complete surrender. The Chinese will probably go in and take that over. But what is Putin looking at? He's weakness. Projecting weakness, not strength. We all know Putin has always wanted Ukraine back. It's a breadbasket of Russia. He never looked at Ukraine as independent. He never accepted it as independent. And it's a birthplace of the Russian Orthodox Church. And it's where, a lot of the wheat is grown. What is Chairman Xi looking at? Taiwan. I signed off 2 years ago because I signed off on all foreign military weapon sales. 2 years ago, weapons that still haven't gone into Taiwan. When are we going to learn the lesson? We didn't properly get them into Ukraine. We need to get them into Taiwan. And then you look at the Ayatollah, and we've got a Iran negotiation going on. And guess who's moderating those negotiations? The Russians, as if they have our best interest at heart. And then finally, Kim Jong-un just fired 2 ICBMs off this month. This is what weakness does invite aggression. And I think this is what you're seeing play out into my opening remarks. Why is Ukraine important? This is why it's important. And in his calculation, Putin thought this is the time. And I'm going to gamble and throw everything I've got into it. I hope that Xi, after they formed their unholy alliance in Beijing, standing hand to hand, they're standing together with a compact, talking about Western aggression and NATO aggression. He told Xi he was going to invade Ukraine, by the way. And Xi told him, well, just wait till after the Olympics. Just wait till after the Olympics. I hope that Xi, and by the way, you know why the ruble is going back up in power? Because China's buying all of Putin's energy. And when I talked to Secretary Blinken, he asked me, do you think we should cut off all imports of Russian energy? I said, of course. And Europe should too. We can't feed the dictator that's committing these acts of barbarism and murder from a moral standpoint, but they're so dependent. And so this is really what's going on, and you can see it coming. And I hope she looks at this and thinks, you know what? Okay, I took a couple dates out with this gal, but maybe she's not looking so good. Maybe I don't want to date her.
That was my question to you, the future of the Russian-Chinese relationship.
But I do think they have committed. He does see Russia as a superpower tied to him. And I hope that he doesn't make the same miscalculation in Taiwan, knowing the more we can unify NATO and the rest of the free world against Putin, the less palatable this is going to look for Chairman Xi. He's going to decide, maybe there's a better way to do this. And you know what I think he's going to do? He's going to look at the next election. President Tsai will be gone in 2 years. Her term will be ending. And they're very good at infiltrating. They're very good at deception. They're very good at disinformation. And I think he could take over Taiwan just like Hong Kong without a shot fired by overthrowing their elections.
That's a narrative I didn't think of. Yeah. But do you think that Xi and China must have some discomfort over Putin's decision to invade Ukraine? Because there is the analysis that China depends, because it's an emerging power and its goals economically and geopolitically, but that they really bank on global security to get their belt and road initiatives done, and Putin has destabilized the global order. So Xi must be discomforted by this.
Yeah, I think he is.
Yeah.
But he's already made this commitment. But they're smart, they're clever, they're deceptive, and they'll support Russia behind the scenes, not overtly,
right.
But they'll do it in a way where they bind their commitment as they look forward to what are they going to do in the South Pacific. And that's why I think the parallels to World War II are so extraordinary to me, because you're looking at, not to overly simplify, but the biggest invasion in Europe since World War II. It's almost like Putin has become the modern-day Hitler, and then Xi is the modern-day Emperor Hirohito, who wants the South China Sea, who wants to take back the islands that our fathers won in World War II. and Putin wanting back what used to be the glory of the empire. Xi wants the glory of the Chinese empire back, and Putin wants the glory of the Russian empire. He fancies himself as a Tsar Stalin. Maybe he's more like Stalin. He's not going to be, his legacy, he thought, would be reclaiming the glory. His legacy is going to be that of a war criminal. And that's why he loses. And that hurts his psyche.
Absolutely. You obviously have a very expert touch on American public opinion. You've won elections. You keep your finger on the pulse. What's your assessment of American public opinion toward the war in Ukraine? And obviously, it's very positive support for Ukraine. We see that it's bipartisan support in the country. That's correct, right?
Yeah.
But how sustainable do you think it is if the third option of just a continuing insurgency, how resilient will American public opinion and support be in the longer term? Do you have any idea on that?
I mean, long wars are hard. I think we've gone through Iraq and Afghanistan, and we're war weary. We've, as 82nd Airborne told me, we fought a lot of little wars.
Right.
This is a major world conflict. And you can't, it's not just Ukraine. Although, you know, it's a major world conflict. And I'll tell you, politically, at the beginning, the narrative was different. Why do we care about Ukraine? There was an isolationist wing of my party that were attacking me, and I don't have to tell you who they are, that I was wrong. And, you know, we shouldn't be getting involved with even giving them weapons. And I think when the horrific images came out and people saw the atrocities, American public opinion shifted. And I like to think that some of us were ahead of the curve, you know, on this. And now I would say there's tremendous support for what we're trying to do to help win freedom.
So you basically agree with President Biden that the big challenge of our time is this competition, for lack of a better word, between the liberal democratic order and authoritarianism in the world in the post-Cold War era. I mean, the ideal after the fall of the wall, in which, you know, I think our diplomacy at the time, and I'm not saying that because Secretary Baker's sitting there, but our diplomacy at that time was brilliant in not dancing on top of the wall when it came down in order to not force Gorbachev into a humiliating position, but to see what we can do to reconstruct the world order after the fall of the Soviet Union. That was the right policy in it. Yeah. But what's your take on this very messy world disorder we're entering into?
I think it's solidifying. You know, I chaired Homeland. The big threat was ISIS and the Caliphate. And we're in the Middle East a lot.
Right.
I know when I got to lead the Foreign Affairs Committee, that now it's the free world versus these nation states that are threatening the world and our freedom, and that's Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. And they are the forces against the forces of freedom. And it's that's the way, you know, I see it. Just like Reagan, you know, Reagan saw it that way. It wasn't overly complicated. He saw, you know, Russia, the Soviet Union, as an evil empire, he called it, you know, and it still is under Putin. And what they do is sheer evil. And I don't think free-loving nations can sit back idly and watch this happen. It's like watching on the playground a bully and a little kid, and the little kid's getting beat up, and you got one hand tied behind your back and you're trying to help him. Mm-hmm. That's kind of like how this feels. And more people I talk to are like, why aren't we helping more? Why aren't we helping more? Help the little kid out. Again, it's like David and Goliath. Give him the sling that's going to take out the big bully, and that is Russia. And we're giving you the slingshots. We should have been doing it last November. That's my criticism. Should have been doing this a long time ago and a lot more powerful weapons. But you have a bipartisan effort, to your point.
Right.
When I came back 3 weeks ago on a bipartisan Codel, and the same thing this time, we were all unified as Americans in our support for Ukraine and what we could do to help, Ukraine. And we passed the sanctions ahead of the president. We passed the appropriations. We passed my war crimes bill. And we're helping lead this president in the right direction.
You mentioned the security, energy security aspects, which are really very important in the Ukraine crisis. Do you see a shifting of the energy supply chains going? Because we're thinking now, as you know better than anyone, especially here in Texas, where the fossil fuel industry is based, of LNG, for example, American LNG becoming a much more reliable provider of energy to Western Europe, for example, weaning the Germans away from Russian gas. But that's going to take some structural changes, more vessels, terminals, and all of that. And then you mentioned China buying Russian energy. Do you think these are structural shifts that are going to take place because of the Ukrainian crisis, or is it a temporary fix?
I think it's fundamental. I think Europe is waking up to the fact that being reliant on Russian energy was a mistake, and particularly Germany. Remember, they're the ones who paid billions of dollars for the Nord Stream 2 pipeline.
Right.
And now I think there's a little bit of buyer's remorse. I think they feel a little bit guilty that they're funding this. And the European conscience feels guilty that they were, being led down this path. The prior administration, we tried to get LNG terminals into Europe, and then Congress mandated the sanctions against Nord Stream so that Europe was not dependent on Russian energy. So with the invasion of, Ukraine, I think they're realizing they were going down the wrong path in terms of energy. I was in Romania. They want small modular nuclear reactors. France is 80% nuclear power, but LNG and these small modular reactors and getting off Russian dependency. It's a moral question, I think, above all. And that was my answer to the Secretary of State was, should we stop importing Russian energy? It's a lifeblood. And it's the lifeblood that they're spilling blood in Ukraine over. And this is an energy issue as much as it is a freedom issue in Putin's eyes. And he wants to dominate the energy market. And we were allowing him to get away with this. And why the president waived those sanctions? Basically enabling this to happen. And then as I talked about his plans in the Mediterranean as well. So I think it's been an eye-opener. And I think it's a fundamental change in the way we view energy. I hope we can produce more of it here, so we can deal with gas prices and not shut down pipelines and not shut down permitting. We can transition, to other energies, but it's not going to happen overnight. And I think the smart way to do this is produce energy. It's our energy security is national security. And I think this president started playing with fire. And it emboldened and enabled Putin to do what he's doing.
Thank you, Congressman. I think we have time for maybe a couple of questions. Just raise your hand and if you have any questions from the audience, and please make it a question and not a soliloquy. Thank you.
Rick Massey, my question is about try again, Rick Massey. My question is about the revenues that Russia gets from oil and gas. My understanding is about 2/3 of it's from oil and 1/3 from gas.
Yeah, that's about right.
And we have said we don't want any more oil. We're trying to get the Europeans to get off the gas, which is going to take some doing. Do you see that happening anytime soon? Especially the oil, since it seems to be the bigger revenue?
Yeah, so the sanctions, the big exception to the sanctions are what they call the energy carve-out exceptions. So we're sanctioning everything but energy. Well, that's kind of his lifeblood, as I mentioned. So how effective are the sanctions when you carve out energy? Now, Europe will tell you, look, we can't completely get off, so we'll tell you, we'll start moving that number. But where are they going to get the energy around Russia? If we're not producing it in the United States to give it to them, then we embolden, OPEC, and I mean, you have to get your energy from somewhere. And I think, the great lesson we've learned about being too reliant on foreign nations for energy is it compromises our national security. And that's why I think this president has gone down the wrong path. But Europe has to find it from some other, and they want to. I mean, the willingness is there. We just have to start changing, not blaming, Saudi for not producing enough, not blaming energy companies for being a monopoly, which is what this president does, but opening up, our permits so we can produce more. And particularly, the LNG stuff. The natural gas is a lot cleaner coming from here than it is from Russia. For the climate change, debate, it's a lot cleaner from the United States. And it's a lot cleaner than what China's doing with Belt and Road and the coal-fired plants that they open every week.
You have a question there? Please stand up. Could you identify yourself?
Yeah, hi, my name's Trevor Smith. Congressman, thank you for joining us, and Secretary as well. Sort of as a follow-up to this gentleman's question is, how does Putin respond if Europe elects to ban oil and gas imports from Russia?
I mean, he's not going to like it, but this argument that we can't be provocative. Well, who's being provocative when he bombs maternal hospitals? When he's when he's choking off Ukraine from the Black Sea, when he's threatening chemical weapons and tactical nukes, when he's, really dominating Europe through energy. This is about a dictator dominating the European continent with energy. And, I'm sorry. Europe is, the giant's finally awakening to the fact that this is not our friend. I would ask the German ambassador, why is Nord Stream so important to you? Well, we want to have normalized relations with the Russians, and we want trade, and we want to be their friends. Well, you ask the German people today how they feel about Putin. And that's what's completely changed, is this perspective that somehow they were going to be a great friend and ally. I think the true colors are coming out.
We have time for just two more questions. We got, we have a microphone there. The gentleman there. Identify yourself, please.
Hi, Congressman Dr. Ahmad. How are you?
Hey, Dr. Ahmad.
Quick question. You mentioned about if they do nuclear or tactical nuclear or chemical weapons, we should do something, or NATO should do something. So if that does happen, what is our response, and will that lead to World War III?
Yeah, and this is a question we worry about every day. We don't want that. We don't want it to escalate to that point, but we have to prepare for it. We have to have discussions about it. NATO is having serious discussions about it. What the line right now is that there will be severe consequences, but we don't know what that means. We don't want to draw a red line like in Syria, and then they cross a red line, and then we say, oh, we didn't really mean that. Just go ahead and cross another red line. So it has to mean something. I mean, the Secretary knows this. In diplomacy, you can't play a weak hand. You got to play through strength. And I think, the message to him is that if you do this, the entire world community is already standing against you. And, but that's, these are decisions that will have to be made. And in terms of what the response is. We don't want a World War III. Putin has a lot of these short-range tactical nukes. That's the one thing he has kept up, and they can be very devastating.
This will have to be the last question, unfortunately. I know there are a lot of hands raised, but
Congressman Michael Balahutrak here. A question to you. Ukraine will win the war, and it will push the Russians to the borders. In your opinion, how far should they go after that? Because obviously pushing them to the borders will give time now for Russia to regroup. What should be the next step?
If Ukraine wins this war, then they have earned their membership into NATO, in my judgment. And that's our obligation to them. I know it's been dicey. I mean, Secretary knows the debates about admitting Ukraine into NATO, but Zelensky's the Churchill of our time and has earned the respect of, I think, all Americans and the free world. And I think the least we can do after we took their nukes away from them is to allow that membership. And then that's the line that Putin doesn't want to cross. He'll go into Moldova, he'll go into Georgia, but he's not going to go into Romania or Poland because he knows Article 5, means something, and he doesn't want to trigger that. So,
ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking the Congressman for
thanks.